My subject tonight, does this thing work? I don't really like microphones, especially in small rooms like this. My subject is market failure, and I'm going to argue that market failure is both an argument for government intervention in the economy and an argument against government intervention in the economy. I want to start by explaining what market failure is, why it is an argument against laissez-faire on the free market, but why it is a stronger argument against the alternative to laissez-faire. Because, as I think I can show you, market failure is the exception on the private market and the norm on the political market. And after I finish discussing all of the political stuff, I want to discuss the relevance of market failure to other things in life, such as marriage, teaching, and war. In many fields, there are technical terms that sound self-explanatory and are not. I am sure that there are many people in the world who think they understand the theory of relativity, except for the mathematical parts. After all, the theory of relativity should mean the theory that everything is relative, and they understand that. As it happens, that isn't what the theory of relativity means. Similarly, market failure should mean situations where markets fail, but I am going to argue that not only are there ways in which markets can fail that are not market failure, but that market failure happens in many places other than markets. So let me explain what market failure is. And I think the answer is that market failure is a situation where individual rationality does not lead to group rationality, where each individual correctly decides what to do, and we are all worse off as a result. And the reason that happens is that these are situations where my act helps me but harms you, your act helps you but harms me. Sorry, I went too far. And the result of that is that we are both worse off, even though each individual is better off for his act. Market failure is not limited to markets. And let me start with my favorite example. I want to assume it's about 1,000 years ago, and you are one of a line of 10,000 men with spears. And your spears are pointed that way. And the reason the spears are pointed that way is that coming at you are another 10,000 men with spears on horseback. And you do a very quick cost-benefit calculation. And you say, if we stand here and keep our spears planted, with luck, we can break their charge. And if we break their charge, some of us die, but most of us live. If we run, horses run faster than we do. So I should stand. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I said we. I don't control him and him. I only control me. I don't decide what we do, I decide what I do. If I run and everybody else stands, one man out of 10,000 has very little effect on whether we stop the charge, and I won't be one of the ones killed. If they run and I stand, I am dead. Whatever the other people in the line are going to do, I am better off running. We all run, and most of us die. Welcome to the dark side of rationality. Let me now give you a less exotic example, but one which I concluded today will be even more familiar to you than to me. I observed this just south of UCLA in Los Angeles, where there were two enormous streets crossing, about 8 or 10 lanes each way. And what would happen would be that the light is about to go red on Westwood Avenue, and the cars keep crowding in, with the result, with everybody trying to get across. And when the light goes red, the intersection is filled with cars. You may have seen this happen yourself. With the result that the people coming the other way on Wilshire Avenue can't get through. And gradually the cars drain out of the intersection just in time for the cars coming this way to fill the intersection as the light goes red here. Right? If everybody waited to go into the intersection until he could get across, they would all get home sooner. But any individual driver who does that is worse off as a result, because my rudeness going this way hurts these people, their rudeness going this way hurts these people. Each of us is getting a small benefit and imposing a large cost on somebody else. All right? Let me give you another example you may also have experienced. You are in a restaurant with your friends, having a pleasant conversation, and the only trouble is that the other people in the restaurant are having conversations too, so it's a little hard to hear your friends, and it's hard for them to hear you. So what you have to do is talk louder, and they talk louder, and they talk louder, and they talk louder, but now you can't hear anybody, so you have to talk really loud. And you end up with everybody talking at the top of his voice. Nobody can hear anyone, and we all end up hoarse. All right? So that is another example of exactly the same logic I've been talking about. It just doesn't happen to be on what we normally call the market. What does this have to do with political issues? And the answer is that there is a simple argument for freedom, which unfortunately is wrong. And the simple argument for freedom is that each person acts in his own interest. Each makes decisions that maximize his net benefit, benefit minus cost. That maximizes net benefit for everyone. So there is no need for government to intervene and change what people do. What is wrong with the simple argument? And I think I've just shown what's wrong. That even if each person rationally acts in his own interest, that does not guarantee that we are acting in our interest. Sometimes I get the benefit of my act and you get the cost. When I pollute the air, for example, or drive dangerously. And I therefore might take those actions even though the cost to you is larger than the benefit to me. We economists refer to these as negative externalities. Sometimes it's the other way around. I pay the cost and you get the benefit. So for example, if I broadcast a radio program, I have to pay for the transmitter. I have to hire a disc jockey or whoever else is producing the station. But anybody out there can listen to it. So I can't charge people for it because I can't deprive them of hearing it if they don't pay me. And therefore, I might not put on a radio broadcast even though it's worth doing, even though the benefit to the listeners is higher than the cost to me. This is what economists call the public good problem, where a public good is a problem where if it's produced, it will be available to all of the members of a pre-existing group, and therefore the producer can't charge for it. All right? Sometimes there are private solutions to these problems. Sometimes if somebody is ingenious, he can figure out a way of solving the problem. For example, some externality problems can be dealt with by putting both of the people in a single firm. So for example, if I provide a free parking lot, that's a benefit to people who park in it and to the stores nearby, and a cost to me. If, however, I have a shopping center, a shopping mall, and I own the mall, and I rent out the places to all the stores in it, then when I provide free parking for people coming to the mall, the benefit goes to the stores in the mall. I collect that benefit because they're willing to pay me more rent since they get more customers. And thus what would have been an externality becomes an internality. And you can see how that happens in lots of ways if you think about something like a shopping mall. The owner of the mall can figure out that there will be a benefit to the movie theater of having a late-night restaurant next to it, because people are more willing to come. There will be a benefit to the late-night restaurant of having a movie theater next to it, and it can therefore arrange to rent one space to a movie theater and one to a late-night restaurant. So there are lots of ways in which that particular set of externalities can be handled. Similarly, some public good programs can be dealt with by ingenuity. It may have occurred to you that although I've just explained why we don't get any radio broadcasts, in fact, we do get radio broadcasts, because some unknown genius thought of the idea of producing not one public good, but two. One public good has a positive cost of production and a positive value to the customers, and that's called a radio program. And one public good has a negative cost of production and a negative value to the customers, and that's called an advertisement. It has a negative cost of production because the company will pay the radio station to put on the ad. So you produce both public goods, you tie them tightly together, and you give away the package. And that, of course, is how radio and television are largely produced. Also, a good deal of stuff on the internet is produced more recently. But although these are particular solutions, there is no guarantee that individual rationality in the market will always produce group rationality. So if we have laissez-faire, if we just let people do what they want, there will be cases where people do things where the cost is larger than the benefit because someone else gets the cost. And there will be cases where something is worth doing but doesn't get done because the person who is producing it can't collect the benefit. Therefore, it is possible for government to step in. This is the violation of laissez-faire, to improve the situation by regulating air pollution and dangerous driving, which makes us all better off, preventing acts whose costs are larger than their benefit, subsidize radio, TV, basic research, making us all better by producing acts whose benefits are larger than the cost. But there is a problem. In order for this to work, the government has to do the right things. But we want to think of the government the same way we think of the private market. The government is not an angel standing up there. It's a bunch of human beings, including most of you. I assume most of you are voters. Part of the political system is the decision by a voter. Another part of the decisions by legislators, by judges, by bureaucrats. We want to think of all those people the same way as we think of the people in the economic system as individuals acting in their own self-interest. So in order for government to improve things, we need some mechanism to make government make the right decisions. Some way that the rational choices of political actors will add up to rational choices for the whole polity. Otherwise, government intervention could make things worse instead of better. And that brings us to the subject of market failure on the political market. That if you think about the political system, including the voters as well as everybody else, most political decisions are made by people who neither pay much of the cost nor receive much of the benefit. The voter who makes himself well informed provides benefits mostly to others. He's bearing the cost but not getting the benefit. The legislator who passes the bill provides costs and benefits to others. The lobbyist who gets the bill passed benefits his customers at the cost of other people who are paying for it. The judge makes decisions, sets precedents, almost all of whose costs and benefits will be borne by others. Hence, there is no reason to expect political actors to take the actions that maximize net benefit. We're back with the same problem with the political system that I already described with the private market. For example, let me start with you, the rationally ignorant voter. There is what I think of as the civics class model of democracy, the naive model of democracy. And the way it works is the government has to do the right things or we'll vote them out. Right? In order for that to work, the voters have to know what the government is doing, indeed what individual politicians are doing, because they're who we vote for, and they have to know what they should be doing. Information is costly. If my vote has any effect, which it usually doesn't, even in a country as small as Romania, for the US, my estimate is that the chance that my vote will change the presidential outcome is somewhere around 1 in 5 million. In the class, how many of them know the name of their congressman? About half of them do. It's very hard to pay attention to what someone is doing if you don't know his name. But they're not stupid, they're not irrational. That information is of no value to them. Right? So most voters are rationally ignorant. If voters are rationally ignorant, they support policies that sound good. They support whatever politicians their friends support, because then their friends will like them. Sound good to somebody who doesn't know very much, has no incentive to learn more, and you end up with a politics of sound bites and demagoguery. Furthermore, politicians have short time horizons. The government is always saying we need to do this because people are too short-sighted. but it's worth thinking about how you make it in people's interest to be farsighted. Let us imagine that I am considering planting a field with black walnut trees. Black walnut is a valuable wood. It's very pretty, but it's slow maturing. So I estimate that it'll be about 40 years before the field is worth harvesting. As it happens, I am 73 years old. So it follows that I will not be alive when the field is worth harvesting. It's still worth planting the trees. For me, for selfish reasons. Because in 10 years, I can sell a field with 10-year-old black walnut trees to somebody else who is younger than I am. And if he's not willing to wait 30 years, he can sell it another 10 years to somebody else. At each point, I'm getting the return for ultimately the 40 years, but I'm getting it for the first 10 years worth of it. So that means that in a private market system, it pays selfish individuals to make investments with payoffs beyond their own lifetime. That's not obvious, and it's interesting. There is, however, a condition we have to meet, and that condition is secure property rights. We need a system where when I plant the black walnut trees, I am reasonably certain that when they mature, they will belong either to me or to the person I sold them to or to the person he sold them to. Suppose I suspect that 20 years on, somebody will come onto the field with a pickup truck and a chainsaw and drive off with a bunch of 20-year-old black walnut trees, which are not as good as 40-year-old black walnut trees, but they're worth something, at which point I or the person who bought it from me gets nothing. In that case, I won't make the investment unless it is so profitable to compensate me for that risk. The same thing is true if I suspect that in 20 years, some enterprising politician will decide that black walnut trees are a national resource and ought to belong to the government and not to selfish people like me. So what that's saying is that in order for it to be in people's selfish interest to engage in long-term planning, you need secure property rights. What about the political market? Consider a politician, say in Romania, who observed 20 years ago that Bucharest did not have a very good metro system, that it didn't have enough capacity, and the stations were too far apart. So for 10 years, he spends money, which he could be using to buy votes, on building new stations and expanding the system. And it takes a while more to get it going. And eventually, Bucharest has a good metro system, by which time that politician is long out of office, and whoever now occupies his spot gets credit for what a nice metro system you have. I gather this did not happen. So if you think about it, the logic of the political system, that politicians have insecure property rights in their political assets. Consequently, it pays them rationally to be short-sighted, to make decisions in the short run. Now, oddly enough, politicians claim to be interested in the future. I don't know Romanian, but certainly in America, and I assume in Romania, politicians say we have to do this for our children. We have to do this for the future. That's because the voters can't see the future. And therefore, you can deliver goods in the future that never arrive, and that gives you some credit for what you're not doing today. The champion of this particular political strategy, I think, was a man from a little bit farther east from here, a very prominent man from the country of Georgia by the name of Joseph Stalin. Because Stalin could not persuade the citizens of the Soviet Union that they had it good then. All right, Moscow, which was the best place to be in the Soviet Union, families were living a family to a room. People were standing in long lines to get things. So Stalin couldn't say to his people, look what a good job we're doing. But he could say, yes, we have it hard. These are the sacrifices we are making so that our children will be as rich as the Americans and our grandchildren will be richer than the Americans. So by offering benefits in the future for a while, doesn't last forever, eventually people get wise, but for a while you can maintain support by claiming invisible benefits in the future and thus getting people to accept real costs. All right? So The result is that in practice, politicians decide what to do by what the effects will be on the next election, while they talk about the good things they're producing for 10 or 20 or 100 years in the future. Let me give you another example. This is a U.S. example. It may apply or may not in Romania. And that's the case of regulation of medical drugs. That a regulator who approves a drug that has an unexpected side effect that kills 20 people is out of a job. All right, 20 corpses is enough to finish you. A regulator who delays a drug, who says we don't have enough evidence to be sure it's safe yet, and kills 100 people, pays no cost. Because the way you kill 100 people is that you delay a drug that has a cure rate of 90%, so people use a drug that has a cure rate of 85%, and that means that an extra 5% of the people who are getting the drug die. But that's a statistical death. Statistical deaths are invisible, and voters are rationally ignorant. And I like to illustrate this by telling the story of the press release from the Federal Drug Agency, the FDA in the US, in which they admitted to killing 100,000 people. Oddly enough, that's not the way they put it. There is a class of drugs that are called beta blockers, which are used to prevent second heart attacks. And beta blockers had been in use in Europe for a fair while, and it was something like 10 or 12 years before the FDA approved them for use in the US. And when the FDA approved a particular beta blocker for use in the US, they estimated that it would save 8,000 to 10,000 lives a year. Well, if it's going to save 8,000 to 10,000 lives a year, and they have kept it out of use for 10 or 12 years, that means that 100,000 people died who would have lived if they had approved it 12 years earlier. So they were quite literally confessing to 100,000 deaths, just not in that language. Let me give you another example of market failure on the political market. Suppose an auto tariff is a tax on the import of automobiles. Suppose the U.S. puts up an auto tariff that benefits the companies that make cars, their stockholders, their workers, to some extent the city Detroit that the cars used to be made in, and so forth. And it imposes a cost on consumers who have to pay more for cars now, and on producers of export goods, because if we import less, we export less. All right, that's the story that was being told a little earlier, only my version is that we can have two different technologies for building automobiles. We can build them in Detroit, or we can grow them in Iowa, and that's the same story. Right? So, but think about the economics of bribing governments, the economics of lobbying, because the auto industry faces the public good problem. If Ford pays a congressman to vote for the auto tariff, General Motors benefits. So just like the case of a radio broadcast, each producer of what's a benefit not for everybody but just for the industry is sharing that benefit with the others. But there are not very many auto companies, and there's one big union. So when you've got 5 or 10 players, it's pretty easy for them to get together and for Ford to say to GM, we'll put in $10 million if you put in $10 million. And for the United Auto Workers to say, we'll tell our workers to vote for Mr. Smith if he supports the auto tariff, and we'll contribute some money too. So if you have a fairly small interest group, they can raise to buy legislation a substantial fraction of the value of that legislation to them. So if we imagine that the auto tariff benefits the companies and their workers by $10 billion, they can probably raise at least $1 billion to bribe Congress to pass it. All right? On the other hand, the losers are several hundred million Americans. Even if their loss is much larger, if they're losing $100 billion to the $10 billion gain, let us say, of the auto companies, they're never going to be able to raise $1 billion to lobby against the auto tariff, because with 200 million people, there isn't any practical way of coordinating them such that you will get each one chipping in money when he knows that if his money is going to have almost no effect out of all of them. So the implication of that is that it is politically profitable to benefit concentrated interest groups at the cost of dispersed interest groups, even when the cost is much larger than the benefit. And it's a fairly striking case because the economics of foreign trade were worked out by David Ricardo just about 200 years ago. One of the implications of the argument is that with rare exceptions, imposing a tariff hurts the country that imposes it, quite aside from anybody else's reaction, that it makes us poorer because it results in our building cars even when it's cheaper to grow them. Essentially, a tariff is a tax on one way of producing goods, namely by trade, relative to another way by home production. The people who support the tariff say they are protecting American auto workers from Japanese workers, but they're actually protecting American auto workers from American farmers. And yet, over the time since Ricardo worked this out, almost no country has had unilateral free trade. England did through much of the 19th century. Hong Kong, which wasn't a country, did it in the 20th century. Those were both spectacular successes. Hong Kong started out with 10 times the population density of the most densely populated country in the world, which was Singapore. It had so few natural resources that it imported drinking water. And sometime in by about the 1970s or 1980s, per capita income of Hong Kong passed that of the United Kingdom. All right, so that's a fairly extreme example of success. So the general point I'm making is that on the private market, individuals usually pay for what they use and get paid for what they produce. So most of the time, individual rationality produces group rationality. For those who have taken a good course in price theory, there are things called efficiency theorems in which you basically show that as long as you don't have a special problem like an externality or a public good, the cost of what you use represents the cost to other people if you're using it. The value of what you can sell your goods for represents the value to consumers of getting it. Consequently, as long as you don't have these special problems, the interest of the individual is the same as the interest of the group. But those problems sometimes occur, so sometimes you have market failure, and sometimes the laissez-faire system does not do as well as a perfectly wise, benevolent dictator would do. But we have a striking shortage of perfectly wise, benevolent dictators. Quite a lot of people who claim the job, I should say, but not many who are qualified. On the political market, individuals almost never bear the costs or receive the benefits of their actions, so they have no incentive to make the choices that maximize net benefit for all. So the result is that market failure is common. That market failure is, as I usually put it, the exception on the private market and the rule on the public market. And this explains the fact that market failure theory, using market failure to say what will happen, does a much better job of predicting political outcomes than of predicting market outcomes. On the private market, market failure theory tells us that there are no radio and television broadcasts. But in fact, there are, because people have found a clever way of getting around the public good problem. The externality theory tells us that externalities shouldn't be controlled, but they often, though not always, are. A large shopping mall, which is private, typically, in my experience, is cleaner and safer than a small village that is public. On the public market, despite the fact that the economic argument for protective tariffs is 200 years out of date, most countries have tariffs. And our theory predicts that, because a tariff benefits a concentrated interest group, the industry, at the cost of a dispersed interest group, the customers. As Gary Becker, the late Gary Becker, unfortunately, pointed out, farm policy in the world, pretty consistently, in countries where there are not very many farmers, the purpose of farm policy is to make farmers richer at the cost of everybody else. That's the situation in the EU, of course. The EU says that it's opposed to African poverty, but it imposes trade barriers against African crops in order that French farmers will be better off. In countries where there are a lot of farmers, on the other hand, agricultural policy is usually designed to hold down the price of crops in order to buy the support of the politically influential urban mob at the expense of the dispersed peasantry. The exact opposite of what you might think democracy would give you, which is when there are lots of farmers, you'll benefit them, when there are a few, you won't. So the conclusion that I am offering is that market failure is an argument for government intervention because it implies that if you had a perfectly wise and benevolent government, it really could improve on laissez-faire. So it's a mistake to claim that laissez-faire is perfect in that sense. But it's a stronger argument against government intervention once one remembers to apply the same analysis to both, to treat both private and public actors as rational individuals seeking their own objectives, not as benevolent demigods taking care of us. So much for politics. Most of your life, like most of my life, isn't politics. So I'd like to talk about the relevance of market failure to other things. I'll start with something which hopefully is not relevant to us, namely how to win battles, but it still makes good stories. And the answer is that if you're a general, you want to try to arrange the battle so that the enemy unit finds it in their interest to run away, and then you don't have to fight them. All right? You want to think of it not in terms of a model where all the soldiers do what they're told, because soldiers are people too, but a model where soldiers act in the way that they think serves their objectives, and sometimes you can take advantage of that. Now, this also raises the problem on the other side. How do you keep the other guy from doing that to you? How do you make it not in the interest of your soldiers to run away? And there are a number of solutions that have been practiced historically. One of them is actually a proverb, at least in English. I don't know if it is in Romanian. And that's burning your bridges behind you. You march your army across a bridge, you line it up to take the enemy charge, your last soldiers break the bridge, and you point out to your soldiers there's nowhere to run, so your best bet is to stand and try to stop them. This is a high-risk strategy, but it sometimes works. Another strategy is to make the individual soldiers care a whole lot about the other soldiers right around them, to make them feel that their squad, their mates, are really important and they don't want to double-cross them and run away and get them killed, and they don't want to look bad to them. And the classical example of this is out of Greek history, ancient Greek history, because there was a military unit of the city of Thebes called the Theban Immortals, which was made up of pairs of homosexual lovers, no one of which would ever betray his beloved or show cowardice in the presence of his beloved. The Immortals won every battle they fought until the last, when they encountered a Macedonian army commanded by Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander, and they died to a man. So that's a solution, which is also a high-risk strategy, but it is a way of dealing with market failure in the military market. Similarly, if you think about running a firm, which I haven't done, I'm only a theorist, part of what you want to try to do is to somehow structure the firm so that as nearly as possible the reward each employee gets corresponds to how much he increases the income of the firm. Sometimes that means that rather than having a single firm with a single hierarchy, you have separate mini firms, departments inside the firm, an accounting system so you can say, well, this department is making us money, this one is losing us money, promote this guy, fire this guy, give bonuses to those people. So you want to set it up in such a way that as nearly as possible you are making the incentives of the individuals correspond to the firm's interest. Now let me get to my own field, which is teaching. And I want to describe what I like to think of as the silent student problem. I have just finished explaining to my students an idea in economics that I have explained 100 times before and could explain in my sleep. So I say to the students, now, did everybody understand that? And nobody says anything. So I keep going, and only when I grade the exam do I discover my mistake. What's happening? The students are being rational. This is again a case of market failure. Each student doesn't know if the others understood it. If he says he didn't understand it, he will look stupid to the other students, which costs him status, which people care about. He will look stupid to me, which might give him a worse grade. Any benefit will be shared with all the other students of getting me to do it again. I have a solution to this problem. Again, I'm a theorist. I haven't implemented the solution, but you can implement it. My solution is you arrange a classroom so that at every place at every seat there is a button on the floor that can be unobtrusively pushed. So I finished my explanation and I said, will everybody who clearly understood my explanation of the principle of comparative advantage please push your button? And the screen at the back of the room shows the number 3. And I go back and explain it again. So that's a case of engineering around market failure. Let me go on to another one that is probably relevant to a good many of you. At home, my wife and I both cook. Sometimes she cooks dinner, sometimes I cook dinner. And the question is, who should clean up? All right, cooking dinner, unfortunately, makes a mess, as some of you may know. And the question is, it's not a matter of fairness. We could either say, every other day I cook and I clean up, and every other day she does. Or we could say, every other day I cook and she cleans up, and the next day she cooks and I clean up. So it's not a fairness issue. The question is, which one should we do? And I only want opinions from people who cook. The rest of you are too ignorant of the relevant technology. Any opinions?
Same thing every night because you are incentivized to make smaller mess.
Very good. Correct. I cook and I clean up, and this is our rule, by the way, or she cooks and she cleans up, because as those of you who cook will know, how much of a mess you make is a variable. All right? You can decide to do a dish that can be done in one pot or a dish that takes 2 pots and a frying pan. You can decide that while the water is coming to boil for one step, you're washing out the mess you made for the previous step. If I'm going to clean up, I take account in how I cook on the amount of mess I'm making. Now, it's true I love my wife, but nonetheless, imposing costs on her is less obvious to me than imposing costs on me. So we do it that way. The same thing applies in child rearing. Imagine that your 3-year-old has made a mess, has done something he shouldn't have done and spilled something, whatever. He's dumped his toys all over the floor, which oddly enough 3-year-olds do. It was cleaning up that mess, getting all the toys back into the toy box, is less work for me than making him do it is for me. Nonetheless, we make him clean up the mess because that gives him a reason not to make messes in the future. All right? So all of these have to do with the logic of market failure as applied in areas that are not political or economic in the narrow sense. All right? Another way of looking at the subject is to consider market failure as a profit opportunity. The fact that there is a market failure means there is some other outcome that would be on net an improvement. If you are clever enough to figure out how to get that outcome, you might be able to pocket some of that improvement. All right? And let me give you 3 real-world examples. The first person who thinks of combining advertisements with radio or television broadcasts, and thus can make money doing that. The first person who thinks we really need a good search engine on the web, but a search engine's got this public good problem. We've got no way of charging people 1/10 of a cent each time they do a search. So how can I make money having a search engine? Light bulb. I give away the search engine, and I charge companies to be easy to find. That's Google's business model. It's made them a great deal of money. Or the first shopping center solving externalities by putting many stores under one roof. I want to end with my favorite example of designing around market failure, which, however, is entirely fictional as far as I know, but it's a good story. 2 Bedouins are riding their camels through the Arabian desert with the oasis a couple of miles away. And one of the Bedouins starts complaining very loudly about his camel. This camel, if it is a camel, I think it's a snail, has got to be the slowest beast in all the deserts of Arabia. And the other Bedouin says, you think your camel is slow? Let me tell you about this rock I'm sitting on. Well, they get into an argument about whose camel is slower, and they decide to make a bet. The bet is that whichever camel gets to the oasis last, his owner wins the bet, and the other Bedouin has to pay him a golden dinar. And you can see what's going to happen. The first camel goes slowly, and the next goes more slowly, and so the first one goes more slowly still. An hour later, there are two Bedouins sitting their camels stock still in the blazing sun in the middle of the Arabian desert with the oasis still a mile away. And at that point, a wise man comes walking by, and he says, why are you two idiots sitting your camels stock still in the blazing sun in the middle of the desert of Arabia with the oasis a mile away? And the Bedouins get off the camels to explain the problem. And the wise man says two words to them, and they leap back on the camels and race off for the oasis as fast as ever they can. What are the two words?
Exchange camels.
When they trade camels, now each one wants the other one's camel that he's now riding to go as fast as possible. Problem solved. So that's an example of engineering around market failure. All right, if you want a lot more information, my website has got the full text of a number of my books. It has got the full text of most of my published articles. If you happen to be interested in medieval cooking, it's got 300 medieval recipes, one of my and my wife's hobbies, as it happens. It even, I should say, has a link to an English translation of a cookbook for a Transylvanian prince from about 1600. I haven't worked for that one, but somebody told me where to find it, and I told someone else, and someone organized a translation. I have a blog called Ideas, in which I talk about whatever I feel like talking about. It covers a whole lot of different things, and you can get a link to it from my webpage, or alternatively, you can go to it directly. All right, so I will leave those things up for the moment while I take questions. Thank you.